All right, Bernie. So you've got some of your notebooks with us today. So go ahead and tell us about them. How big are these notebooks that you utilize?
Well, most of them are 10-cent tablets that we bought at the PX because they didn't really give us any notebooks, but they gave us, you could take out a big clipboard. They thought we should use clipboards. But the reality of it is, we went to the PX, we bought our own for 10 cents, our own little notebooks, spiral notebooks. And that was how we went out the field. We had our own notebooks. We took our own notes. We came back. We wrote the stories up from them. And so the theory that we were given reporter notebooks is debunked because we were just given what we went down to buy. I mean, they didn't care how you took notes, but most of us found it convenient to do this. So these are my kind of treasures. They kind of document my stories. They document the ones I wrote. They document the ones I didn't write. Uh, so anyway, that plus the one big diary on a paper, so you had to have a bigger one. And that was my last one that has all my last stories, including up to Ted. But that's my that's my treasures and my, as we say, that's my verification of some things that I said I did or where I was supposed to be.
Well, in many ways, it's your legacy as a writer in the Marines. In many ways, it's a legacy for you as a writer in the Marine Corps.
Yes, that's true. I mean, it not just me, but the group I ran with, the Snuffies. It still documents all of their doing.
Now, with that first book that you have there, you made mention that we have a correction to make today.
Well, I suppose it's safe to say in front of your audience, I had a brain fart. And I told you the other day that I was with 1-7 on my first operation. It actually was 3-7. I just found that out by leafing through my old notebook again. Sometimes it reminded me of several stories I didn't get written. I don't know why. And some of them I wrote. But anyway, I wanted to correct that. I haven't got the honor of serving with 1-7, but I have been out with 3-7.
Now, with these notebooks and the different units you served with, how long would a notebook generally last you before you had to get a new one?
Well, this would probably, looking at it very quickly, I would say it would last me about 6 or 7 stories, 8 stories, I think. If you're asking about the distance, I mean, these are all handwritten notes, but they all cover different operations. But I would say that, as you can see, there were all kinds of stuff written in here. Uh, Starting with the 3-7 operation, and then I see here bowls moving up into. So this first book took me from 3-7 to 2-1.
Wow.
Initial stories.
And with that, I mean,
Excuse me, I'm terribly wrong. They were not 10 cents. They were 5 cents.
and but with that, it's an incredible primary source, though. I mean, we're looking in a small glimpse into Vietnam right there just with that notebook.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the wandering of a misplaced reporter who wanted to do his job.
Well, and from what I've gathered, phenomenal job at that, just by some of the stories that you've sent me and that I've read on my own and the Sea Tigers I have that we gathered. And so when you would write these stories, What happens when you get back out of the field? Do you type them up on a typewriter and send them back? What's the process?
Well, that was an interesting situation because if you what I did in 2-1 is I to file my stories, I'd go out on patrols, I'd go on operations, I'd come back. It wasn't at the end of the month because the end of the month we all tried to get back into Nang together. I mentioned that the other day. Uh, but what happened was I made a deal with the chaplain, second battalion, First Marines chaplain. I noticed he had a nice brand new Royal typewriter, and I was working at that time typing my stories up with the admin clerks, and they worked till midnight. So it wasn't until after midnight that I could get a typewriter. I could type my stories. Well, I noticed the chaplain had a nice brand new Royal, and I happened to walk by one day, and I said, "Sir, I was wondering," and I introduced myself, showed him my press pass. I said, "I was wondering if there's any possibility I could type some of my stories up on your typewriter." And he said, "Well, yeah, but there's you're going to have to type up my sermon notes." I said, "It's a deal, not a problem. I can handle that." So I typed up his sermon notes, and he let me use his typewriter to file stories, which I then put in a pony, what they call the pony envelope, and sent it back to regiment and then division.
Now, would you ever make copies and send stories home as well?
Uh, I didn't send copies home, but I do. I think I did forward you copies. Once I wrote the story, it had to be it had a format. Third Marine Corps District, First Division, First Regiment. It had a heading on it, and then I wrote, Da Nang, Quang Tri, wherever I was at. That was the format. And what we did is we typed it up as best we could, and then they were put in envelopes and sent down to 3 MAF, Third Marine Force, down to CIB, the Combat Information Bureau. They were sent down there where they either retyped them, edited them, or they sent put them into the mill to go to the kid's hometown and those kind of things. But then the ones were also selected to go into the Sea Tiger.
Well, and to an extent, it had to give you a little bit of pride seeing your stories starting to appear in Sea Tiger, and of course, these guys coming into you and saying, "This is what's happening now." So, what's that feeling like, knowing that you're becoming known as a writer?
Well, it was very important to know that you're becoming known as a reliable attachment. That was really the big significant. But it was a payoff to my time with the grunts that I could write their stories. And it was a payoff in that I knew that if I could get the stories right, and if they went through the whole process, they got published somewhere back to the kid's hometown. Well, that was to me a great accomplishment. Of course, I have to admit, I loved getting a byline in the Sea Tiger. I mean, let's face it, the old journalism thing was one bylines are wonderful, but they don't feed you. Uh, but it was good to see my stories. I mean, I took pride in what I wrote,
Well,
and when they published them, it was even more pride.
well, and speaking of that, was there ever any bonus or incentive for getting a story published?
No, no, it well there was. Excuse me. Yes, there was a not a bonus, but there was a tremendous uh, competitiveness between us and the Third Marine Division ISO, which were up north, and they didn't operate like we did. I don't know why, but they didn't have their reporters didn't gel that well, and they didn't gel with the photographers, and it was so anyway. The story was we looked forward to getting most of our stories, more stories in Third Marine Division, and more stories in the Air Wing. We took pride in the fact that our stories for that week outnumbered them in the Sea Tiger. Didn't happen all the time, but it did happen enough times that we took a great deal of pride in that.
Now, would that create any bragging rights and little just picking fun at the Marine Air Wing riders, or if you ever bumped any of the Third Marine Division guys?
Well, Yeah, I did bump into a couple of them up in Dong Ha, but they weren't they didn't their structure was different. I don't know why. We've often talked about it as years have gone by, but it was in our case was a once in a lifetime deal of people coming together with skills and backgrounds and talent and putting those all together. It was like we didn't, if you'd come there in 66 and left by 67, you weren't in the same group that we were in. Our group was kind of a tight, very tight group. As I said, we had several people that were officer candidate washouts, and it was a matter of pride. I mean, we just came together and made a working force, and we took great pride in what we did, whether it was stories or radio interviews or photographs. I mean, that was our big thing, was the fact that we had enough power and talent that we left our mark.
Well, and when you think about it, I mean, outside of yourself, with your writing skills, you've got Earl Gerheim, you've got Del Dye. I mean, you got the photographers that come into play in itself. Even Gus Hasford to mention as a writer, but you've got Dennis Fisher, you've got R.J. Del Vecchio, you've got John Pennington. You've got a phenomenal work of individuals that come together to make the First Marine Division ISO.
And photo.
And I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, looking at the Sea Tigers with the skills of the riding and the photographs taken by you guys in First Mardiv, I mean, it's phenomenal. It's an incredibly rare glimpse into the talent that you guys had in the Marine Corps. And for a lot of you, it spilled over after the Marine Corps.
Yes, it did. Yeah. Several of us went on into different careers that were related to that. We had Bob Ding Bayer, of course, worked on the LA Times for 30 years. And we had several more people that worked in the radio business. And we had several people. I did 3 years myself as on the Napa Register up in Napa, California, on daily paper. And we had others that went into really editing and writing for a couple of magazines. One was in New York, Tom Donelon. Several of them continued the career that was related to writing.
And with that, I mean, it's the importance of your jobs, the impact that it had on you. I mean, a lot of you, it impacted your entire careers, even to this day.
Yes, I could say that.
Absolutely.
I mean, my besides my time as a reporter and working in the newspaper business, I went to work on the Trident submarine missile program in 1976, and I was hired as a technical writer and editor. Well, that involved that ended up fast enough that I've kind of excelled. I was working with a group of industrial engineers, and pretty soon I could understand them and talk to them and write what they couldn't write. And so I made a career basically out of working with industrial engineers and all engineers on missile programs. And my skill, even though became a section leader or group leader, my basic skills always went back to my writing ability.
Well, and not to jump ahead of ourselves, but it did spark a question for me is that did you ever use the Sea Tigers in your resume for anything like this or sample writing that you would bring up?
Well, I have a story that's a little sore spot, but uh, I'll share it with you off camera. And if you think it's worthwhile, I'll tell you about it.
Yes, sir.
But um, I forget your question again, Zach. I'm sorry. My mind went off somewhere else.
It's okay, Bernie, but would you use the writings that you did?
Yeah. When I came home, of course, I came home kind of different than the rest of the people. I came home on a medevac, and I spent almost a year in the hospitals, Navy hospitals, one in Long Beach and one in Oak Knoll, California. And so when I got ready to go out and look for work, I put together a small notebook, like you would say, and of my combat stories because I didn't have anything else. I mean, I had some credentials that went back to a weekly newspaper in North Dakota and a weekly newspaper in Washington, but there weren't enough to make it worthwhile. So yeah, I went out and I showed people why. But you got to remember, this is 1969, 1970. And the last thing a paper wants to do is take a chance on a disabled Vietnam vet because of all of the baggage that went along with supposedly being a Vietnam vet. So the first time I went for a job interview and showed him my credentials, basically it was for a daily newspaper. Basically, the editor said, "Well, we see that you got talent, but we just don't feel we want you in our newsroom at the time because we don't know how to deal with disabled people." Of course, this was long before there was the American with Disabilities Act, but I was dismissed because I had a cane and I was a Vietnam vet.
Wow.
But we got over that. I went to work for another paper that was in the same chain, and the editor that, you know, cut me down eventually came to work in our paper and was just basically relegated to a headline writer because of some things that he had done in his paper up there, which put him in jeopardy with the chain. I worked for the Swift branch of the uh, paper. And anyway, long story short, is eventually he ended up coming back to work where I was at. And one day in the lunchroom, after he arrives there, he looks over at me. He says, I interviewed you, didn't I, for a job up at Petaluma?" I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "But we just didn't have an opening at the time." I said, "No, you did have an opening, but you told me you didn't want to hire a disabled Vietnam veteran." "Oh, I didn't say that." I said, "Well, the whole lunchroom just heard you say that." Anyway, it as the old saying goes, payback is a mother.
Well, and I think that's an excellent point, and you're absolutely correct. Karma is a bitch, payback is a mother, and it's a fact.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah,
let's take it back to 1967. The next big operation that you went on with Echo Company was Operation Medina. So, what happened on that operation?
that was a bad one. Uh, we went in with two companies that I was associated with. One was Echo, and we were backed up by Alpha Company 1-1, Alpha Charlie. I can't remember. I think it's Charlie Company. Anyway, we went into LZ. What I remember the most about the kickoff was I went down to see the lieutenant that I worked with, Schweitzer, and I said, "Where are we headed, sir?" And he got out a map. He said, "Can you believe this? They gave us this map. It's a French Forest Service map. It shows picnic areas. It shows geological and plant areas. It shows towers." He said, "This is a 1954 French forestry map." He said, "That's what we got. We're going in the jungle in something called the Highline National Forest. It was supposed to be a tourist stop." But he said, "Obviously, it's not unless you're on the NBA side." We knew we were headed into NBA country. From the time that we moved north out of Da Nang in early October 1967, and we were sent up to Quang Tri to take over positions that had been abandoned by the South Vietnamese, we knew that we were going to be fighting NBA. It wasn't any more Viet Cong, and that was held out true. So I went with Echo, my usual company, which was sent along with, as I said, I think it's Charlie. Lions of Medina. You and I talked about that the other day. I can't remember. I get my notebook out and I remember. But anyway, we ramped up for that, and two photographers came along. Uh, One was Pennington, the other one was uh, uh, sometimes when you start to think about something, it doesn't happen. But anyway, they came in along with MJ Coates came in. And Coates and I worked together, and the two other photographers from Third Division decided they'd go with the 1-1 company in 1-1, and we would stay with the company at 2-1. Well, the next morning after we got resupplied in ammunition and food and everything, they set off into the brush. So we pounded around all that day, took some sniper fire, walked into an ambush. But then that night we dug back in. And during that night was when the company from 1-1 was overrun. And they were completely and under surrounded and taking a lot of casualties between on off in the forest, and they were over on another ridge line away from us. Between us and where they were, there was this valley with a small river in it. So they were taking a terrible beating. In fact, they called in Spooky, which is the Gatling gun, M60 Gatling gun airplane, which once it turns loose, there's not a leaf left on the tree. And so they called in Spooky and tried to get, and then they called in some illumination, and we went down to the river because we were trying to go from our ridge down the river and get up and help them, Charlie. Well, what happened was we got hit at the ambush at the river because they had expected we would come to their relief. And so we got pinned down and had to withdraw because we didn't have enough support to get across the river. So we had to sit down there in the valley and listen to all night to those guys being beat up, plummeted, killed, you know, heavy casualties. And there wasn't anything we could do because we couldn't get out of the river valley. They had us pinned down. The next morning was bad. They had the photographer that was with us that went with First Marine Charlie Company was killed. Became a Medal of Honor winner. Perkins. The rest of us, uh, Mike, MJ Coates, and I came out without any scratches, but we were down with the relief force, and it was not a comfortable place to be. So rather than send us up to help what was left of Charlie, they sent us back into uh, going through the forest looking for the. We thought we could pick up stragglers that were involved with the big ambush. So we went back and pushed into the area. I wrote that story about finding the NBA hospital and the NBA rest and relaxation area. We hit that and had a fight with them there. That story tells about the uncovering the hospital and everything. Interesting thing about that was when we found the hospital, which was, a fairly well set up hospital complex surrounded by what I would call an R&R complex. Uh, we got into the bamboo operating room of the NBA, and the first thing Doc Turner, the corpsman, came out with, he said, "Look at this yet." And he looked at it and he said, "Here with all the surgical tools, in a roll up leather conflict," and it says, "From the friends and the supporters of your battle against the embassy, for your battle against the invading forces sent from East Germany." They were all East Germany friends that sent the medical tools. So he kept those. I don't know where they went, but they were a whole bunch of stainless, surgical tools from the NVA's friends in East Germany.
Well, and to talk about that, even in itself, I've heard a lot of Marines mention seeing R&R areas or hospitals, and they would find things from American college students, from English students and English supporters, but from East Germany. I mean, that feeds into, the communist side of things, supporting the communist effort.
Yes, yeah. We were told at one point that there are a lot of volunteer medical professions that were up in North Vietnam. They came rotated in and out of North Vietnam to take care of the wounded. I don't remember anybody saying that they captured other nations, other people from other different nations, but we knew all along that the whole Soviet empire was in support of the NBA along with the whole Chinese empire, and it made sense. We uncovered a lot of training areas and medical areas, uh, but that one was particularly memorable.
Absolutely. And I mean, and with this operation with Perkins, I've read a citation, and it goes back to what you and I talked about last time, that at the end of the day, every Marine's a rifleman, and every Marine will take care of those around him, because if I'm not mistaken, he jumped on a grenade to save those around
Yes, yes, he did.
him. And go ahead, Bernie.
No, he made the ultimate sacrifice by taking his helmet and dropping on top of the grenade and saving the lives of the other people. I I, I only remember that when they did the presentation of his Medal of Honor, there was one or two Marines that came to the presentation, and they had been alive simply because of what Perkins did.
Wow. And in many ways, that has to be moving for a lot of people, considering he wasn't a grunt with Charlie 1-1, but he was a grunt nonetheless.
Yeah, when your back's up against it, you just do what you're trained to do. It's amazing how that training kicks in when you're really at what you say pucker power. Uh, it it's all about training, and that's why the Marine Corps has such a strong training ethos, because they know that once you're trained properly, they know how you're going to react in certain circumstances.
Well, that, and of course, what's instilled in you as a Marine, it's something that's there always.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah. I mean, 65 years later, I'm still a Marine. I got a piece of paper that says I'm a retired sergeant.
and with that, it's that attitude. I mean, I've never heard a Marine call themselves ex-Marine or former Marine. It's always
No,
never ever.
no. But you might hear him say former Reverend, but you never hear him say ex Marine. That's solely the world of journalism, which doesn't understand the difference between ex and former.
Now, speaking of Operation Medina, what was the terrain like in Quang Tri compared to where you had previously been operating?
It was completely different, Zach. We were going into what you'd call a three tier canopy. It was heavily forested. It had several river valleys that ran through it, but it was dense, very dense undergrowth, it was literally a ridge line, a valley, and another ridge line, and that was what the whole thing. Looking back at the French maps, what they called the Highland National Forest, you can understand why it was truly a forest. It had not been logged over for many years, and so there was really high, tall trees, and then all the underbrush in between it, and then going and slipping down into ravines, and sometimes they'd have be creek ravines, sometimes they'd be dry ravines, but it was different than there was no sand, there wasn't any beach, there wasn't any. It was completely different than what we had been fighting in south of Da Nang.
Well, And to go to that as well, traversing it had to be difficult even for a company, just due to the dense foliage and, of course, the constant worry about elevation changes.
Yeah. I mean, one company I was with when we were coming out of the highline forest, the only thing we had was two machetes, and they had to cut the underbrush with two machetes and rotate the lead squad. Rotate for 5 minutes each, chopping brush to get us out of there. That's how deep it was and how thick it was.
Well, and to speak on that, how long did it take them to cut through and to get out of the Haifang forest?
Well, when the order came that the operation was over and we were told to pull back, we were told that we would not be getting relieved with helicopters. We had to work our way out to the Highway 1, and there'd be six bys waiting. And we started out, you know, took us a day and a half to get out of the jungle. And then we got into what it was still canopy, but it was more like elephant grass and taller trees, not so much underbrush, but we were fighting a lot of elephant grass. In fact, it was elephant grass that that hid the ambush that almost wiped out uh, the uh, six. I'm trying to remember. He wrote a book about it. Um, I'll send you the book. Uh, anyway, there was a terrible ambush on Delta Company coming out of the high lying into the lowlands, and they got ambushed and took multiple casualties. We set up a corridor to get helicopters in medevac, but they took a real beating. You talk to people who were Delta 2-1, and they'll tell you that it was a terrible beating that they took. They lost quite a few numbers. And these were guys that were coming out, after we'd been in the highline forest for 4 or 5 days. They finally came out on a level plain. They got ambushed.
Well, and to speak of that with this forested area, I mean, you're also using maps that are 12 years old. I mean, were the maps useful at least?
Now, well, yeah, yeah, there was. Uh, there was one place that was shown to have cabins, for a resort, cabin kind of place where you could rest overnight. We have them here in Washington, Western Washington, with all of our hikers, where they have the certain area where they have a little cabin, the rest area you can come in. Well, we found a couple of the French rest areas, and one of the things that we found was a geological survey stake. Those things that somebody put in many years ago, identifying that at a longitude height. Well, whatever was on, I can't remember now, what was on that U.S. geologic, or not U.S., it was French geological pin, showing that, that just like we have National Geographic markers in certain areas in our woods and our mountains up here. So we found that to be rather interesting. French national uh, identification, longitude, latitude, uh, degrees, all very proper in French, which obviously had been put there before they left the country. France has been there for a long time, as we all know, and I suspect that they did the geological surveys, like which many countries do, is geological surveys. I suspect they did those probably before they had to leave Vietnam in the 40s, because after they came back in the late 40s, early 50s, they didn't have time to do geological research.
You think it's still there to this day, that little stake you found?
No, I think so. Yeah, I'm sure it's still there. It was anchored in cement.
Well, and to bring this up, we've got a story that I was able to find that you had shared with me about Operation Medina that made it into a sea tiger. So, in this story in itself, you describe it as Marines versus NVA Indian style. So, what was happening here with this story?
Well, it was a very ju- ju- it was jungle area, so there was you couldn't see more than 5 or 6 feet before you ran into another bunch of jungle, and the mountainous jungle was a problem, and so with ravines and everything, and apparently we got down there and we were pinned down at one point by a machine gun. This is on the way to the hospital, and we got caught in the trail. And of course, the trails that were old trails left over being used by the NVA, but they've been left over for a number of years, and we could see them on the map. So we were walking into this ambush, and so we couldn't tell exactly where the NVA were. We could hear the gun, we could hear the bullets, but we weren't sure where they were because of the jungle canopy and the undergrowth. And so these two guys just, started crawling on their belly through the lower brush and to find out, and then they did find out where the NVA were and took care of that. But it was a very difficult task because that brush, you don't understand it, but that brush was as dense as a forest. I mean, alongside either side of the trail was nothing but brush, and so when you got pinned down, you couldn't tell where the fire was coming from, and that's why these two guys went out and did what they did. They were successful at it.
Well, and it's like I read the article in itself, and the NVA that they killed was clutching a live hand grenade whenever they stumbled across the body. I mean, that's just in- terrifying to think about that you've just killed the guy that's trying to kill you, and you investigate the body, and there's a live hand grenade that's almost to the point of detonating.
Yeah, yeah, that it wasn't booby trap. That was just one that didn't get off. Um, the interesting thing about uh, using hand grenades in that jungle in that environment, it was useless to use one because if you threw it, it just bounced out off the undergrowth and it would come back at you if you weren't careful.
Wow.
That that was a concern that was like you have an M79 blooper, and so you determine that you need to drop a 40 millimeter round over the hedge. Well, you can't because if you fire it into the hedge, it's strong enough, it'll bounce it back. So it took a real knowledgeable person to know whether or not you were going to fire a blooper or if you were going to fire a grenade because you didn't know if that was going to come back at you because of the density of the brush.
Well, and with that too, I mean, going back to this ambush that was sprung, you could quite literally walk right on top of an NVA soldier because it's so thin.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they were well camouflaged. Of course, they controlled, the area. Um, they were carrying a lot of grenades, as you said, uh, and but I think they were realized just as we realized there was no sense in throwing grenades because the darn things could bounce back at you. You had to have a clear open field to throw a grenade.
Now, being in the Quang Tri province, did you experience many booby traps compared to where you were operating down south by Da Nang with the Viet Cong?
They weren't the same kind of booby traps, Zach. They were different. Uh, Down south, as I talked with you, they put an M60. I can't remember the number now, but they take one of our hand grenades, pull the pin, stick it into a C ration can, tie it to a wire to the gate to the villa, and then you would be dumb enough to open the gate and get the grenade off. Here, they were working on artillery rounds. They actually had enough knowledge that we found places where they would take a 90 millimeter shell that did not explode and they'd cut it up and pull out the ammunition or the ammunition, the detonation part of it. And we did not find that much uh, booby trapping. If there was booby trapping, there was cases where booby trapping was when they had found some, they left behind one of their people, that that person would be booby trapped in the event that you didn't walk up and just roll them over. Because if you did, you probably would detonate. But most of the time, it was a matter of having to go, excuse me, having to watch out for big explosives because that was what they were working with. Their uh, engineering people were taking our unexploded ordnance and repurposing it.
Well, and to mention a 90 millimeter explosive or even a 105 howitzer shell, that's devastating if you hit that in a booby trap for the point man and the point team.
For the whole squad.
Now, you did mention something that did catch my attention in the article. When these Marines captured the machine gun, what would you do with captured weapons? Would they save them or would they turn them over?
Our experience was when you had a helicopter come in, you would take the enemy weapons and you'd hand them out to people to carry. And as soon as we could get a helicopter in with ammunition, food, whatever it was, we threw in the arms. We threw in the AK-47s, the AK-50s, Chicons, whatever we had. Because we didn't, there was a time, now that you mentioned, I remember, we got into a fight with the NBA south of Quang Tri. And the next 2 days later, we went around and rounded up their weapons. And what we did is the engineers booby trapped and blew them up because there was no way of getting them back out of the field. So we just blew them up.
Wow.
That happened more than once.
Well, and you're preventing, of course, the NVA from using it again.
Yeah. And the story about grunts picking up their AK-47s and carrying them. No, grunts didn't do that because if they were stupid enough to carry an AK-47 or an AK-50 or the Bolt operation, the SK-44. I mean, so you're on patrol and you get ambushed, and the first thing you do is you stand up and start firing your AK-47 souvenir. The next thing you're going to do is get a whole lot of M16 rounds in your position. So that was one of the first things that the new guys had to learn was don't think you're going to carry a weapon that is, an NBA weapon, because you fire that sucker, you're going to have more incoming than you ever dreamed of. But, you go by sound. We all knew what an AK-47 sounded like. We knew what an SK-44 sounded like. But that was something that was taught, had to be taught early for a new guy.
Well, and to speak on this and continue as well with these captured weapons, of course, I mean, for the new guys that come in, captured weapons could be excellent learning tools back in the combat bases on how they operate, the sounding of them in itself. And did you see a lot of that?
I didn't see a lot of what you'd call training. I think they were, when the first guys came in, they were probably taken to the rifle range, and they were showing what an AK-47 sounded like, what an AK-50 sounded like. So I think they knew the difference, because particularly after we all went from M14s to M16s, was that the rounds were entirely different. When the M14s and the AK-47s, there weren't that much difference between the sound, really. I mean, you had to learn, but they were not as distinct as an M16 was a whole lot different sounding than an AK-47.
Well, and to continue with this idea in the Quang Tri area, because it's so dense, that dense forest has to play with the sound of these rifles and machine guns going off, does it not?
What's that? I'm sorry.
With the density of the forested area in the jungle in the Quang Tri province, that definitely has to play with the sound of weapons going off because it's so dense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it changes a lot uh, because of the density. It's like out here in the Western Washington when it's fall and you live like I do about 8 blocks from a busy street. During the summer, you don't hear the traffic. As soon as those leaves fall, it's traffic all winter. So yeah, the changing of the brush makes a difference in the sound of where you are.
Now, with being in Quang Tri, was the climate different due to the fact that you're at a higher elevation? Was it colder? What was the weather like?
It was colder. It was a higher elevation. It was it was rain, heavy rain up in that area. Of course, it was the time of the year, October, November. It was wet time of the year. Uh, it was we were in mountains, basically a mountainous area. We were at a what you call what we didn't call them those days, but we realize now they were what they call fire team bases. But when we were at Quang Tri, it wasn't that far to the jungle because it was Quang Tri was right on the edge of the Laos border, close to it.
Now, with the fire team base, were those pretty common to start popping up in 1967?
No, not in 67. They weren't that. We got most of our artillery and firepower came from Camp Carroll, Camp Rock Hill. That we had a few of them set up, but not like it did later in 69 and 70 where they take over a whole hilltop and dedicate it with artillery and everything. We didn't do that during the time I was there, other than they put people at Quang Tri, they put people at Camp Evans, Camp Carroll, and they had artillery and the rock pile. Those are places where they observed incoming trails and the incoming movement, and so they could fire artillery from a observation point that they could see. But no, in the times we were there, we had a lot of activity up around Contian, of course, but that was all denuded. You could have fields of fire from a mile because most of the Agent Orange and bulldozers had carved out that whole area of Contian, which was a half a mile from the DMZ. And so that was just, I think I've sent you a picture. If not, I'll send you a couple of pictures of Contian that I have.
And
Uh,
so I've got to fix something with my mouse real quick, and I'm going to ask the next question while I do that. So if I disappear from the screen, ignore me for a moment. But um, when Operation Medina ended, did 2-1 stay in the Quang Tri province and go into the next operation? What happened?
yeah, after Medina, well, we'd already been what they call mounted out. In early October, they mounted us out in south of Da Nang, moved the whole battalion up to Quang Tri City, Quang Tri area. And from there, we operated small patrols and base and ambushes and got acquainted with the country. But what happened was uh, we started getting into more and more conflict with the NVA. So they decided they would have an operation like Medina. After Medina was over, they decided the best thing to do was to continue to patrol the DMZ area. And so we started having Operation Lancaster, Operation Kentucky, Kentucky 2, Osceola. And we were just out constantly on operations, sweeping around Contian, the rock pile, that whole area bordering on the DMZ, because they were coming in force. We would run into well organized company sized ambushes. So once we were at Quang Tri, which we operated as our battalion headquarters. Uh, but from then on, we started combining our companies with Third Marine Division companies, which was that Quang Tri area was initially their responsibility. but they had so much fighting and so much contact going on that they sent us, Second Battalion, First Marines, they sent us up to Quang Tri to help bolster up the Third Marine Division Rifle Company. So we were there. Oh, I have to look at my notebook, but it seems to me we started out with Operation Lancaster, which would have been about towards the end of October, and we were doing sweeps. Just we would patrol back and forth 4 or 5 days out back to Thien and patrol more. And finally, it just got to where we just went from Lancaster 1 to Lancaster 2, and then they kept us out there, and we rechanged it, called it Kentucky 1, and then we called it Kentucky 2. And into November, we were in something called Osceola. So we were out literally for 3 weeks plus, 3 weeks just patrolling back and forth and in the areas and making contact wherever we could. But it was basically constant. And then of course, November they took 2-1 and moved them up to Contienne and rotated the battalion that was in there. And so our guys went up there, but I stayed behind and worked with the company that was left to do the patrolling. So I was out there until November 10th, which was the Marine Corps birthday. We finally went back up to Contienne, and I joined everybody up there, and that's where I did my writing from then. After we finished doing this 3 week long sweep back and forth.
Well, and speaking of these sweeps in the ridge lines and areas of Quang Tri, how
Yeah.
would you get medevac casualties out? I mean, with the dense foliage, the triple canopy, like LZs aren't always available with wide open spaces. So, what did you witness?
Well, that's why you had engineers with C4. You could use C4 to just drop a tree down in a minute. You could work on creating an LZ area by blowing it down or cutting up the trees. When Charlie Company got overrun, in order to get the dead and wounded out, they dropped in engineers with the chainsaws to just cut down a heliport or helipad. So when you got wounded in the jungle, it was more complicated because we had to get sometimes had to get to a clearing. And if you got a clearing, you had to make sure it wasn't in the control of the NBA. But most of the time, if you needed a helipad, particularly in Quang Tri, there were a lot of shell holes and areas that sometimes cleared out enough that you could bring a chopper in. But many times, to get immediate choppers in and out, you blew the trees, you blew the underbrush. That's why you had C4. You could tell when they blew them up because they just riddled the base of the tree, but they all fell down.
Now, operating, of course, clearing out these LZs, would the NVA try to ambush these areas knowing that you had cleared LZs?
Well, they observed whatever they they knew we were bringing in LZs, but a lot of times we brought in, if you're going to create an LZ, first thing you're going to do is move some Trump troops in there to secure the LZ. So sometimes the medic backs and resupply choppers had to wait until we secured the landing zone. And that sometimes could take a little bit of time because you had to get it, so if you're out patrolling and you got 2 companies full of Marines, there's enough to secure an LZ. But you had to create one that was near enough that you could gather that many Marines to do LZ security. I don't know. The Army did it different from what I've heard. But in our case, we had to secure the LZ, and sometimes the LZ had to be created.
Well, when it came to LZ security, what would be the process on that, seeing that you witnessed it?
Your companies would deploy the platoons around the perimeter of of the LZ that we were creating or had found. Sometimes it had, you could find a wide spot in the jungle that had been deforested or blown to bits, and you could make an LZ pad out of that. But what you did is you had your company or your platoons, and you deployed them around the circle with providing your machine guns, your mortars, and bracketing in your artillery, so that by the time that LZ was open for business, it was pretty well under control.
Well, and the bird gets in there, brings supplies, get wounded out. But did you have any issues getting food or water to you out in this jungly part of the world?
Well, in November, when we were out what they call trace, I was talking about 3 weeks out in the trace. Of course, the rain, that northern area, in November, the rain started coming, and the visibility was zero sometimes because of the rain and the fog. And sometimes you wouldn't get a resupply chopper in when they were supposed to come in and bring in more troops, more ammunition and food. There was one operation where well, Lancaster, Kentucky, I can't remember. We couldn't get resupplied for 5 days because the choppers couldn't get in because they couldn't see the alley. If you can't see the zone, you don't fly in. And so we were getting a little desperate for food. Uh, we went back and dug up an area where we had bunkered in for a couple of days, and we'd been resupplied then. Well, everybody threw away the fruitcake, threw away the ham and mine and mothers, and we just buried them and left them there, thinking we weren't going to pack them. Well, we found out 3 days later we came back and dug them back up because we needed them.
Now, with that 5 day window, what did people do for water?
Well, we brought in water from Thien. Thien brought it out to the field in trucks. Thien had vehicles up there.
Wow.
And so they came down from Thien down through the trail that you could get ambushed and did get ambushed oftentimes. But they would come down to out of Thien and into the flat where we were at. I can't remember the name of the place now, but it was before you got to Dong Ha. And they would come down with whatever we could get from them. We got food and we got sea rations, uh, and a corpsman. But that was it. I mean, they brought the water in when the helicopter couldn't bring the food and the ammunition. We got some out of Thien.
Well, and I guess that feeds into Marine Corps logistics and how this was a well connected system of keeping you grunts in the field as supplied as you could be.
Well, logistics did the best they could. Sometimes we didn't think they did, but we never ran out of ammunition. We might have been hungry for a day or two, but the most important thing was we got ammunition, we got water, we got food, and we got our wounded out.
Well, and it leads me to ask this question, you're tired, it's cold, you've been in the field for weeks. How do you do it? How do you continuously do it without going crazy? It's raining, it's foggy. Like, how do you keep yourself sane out there?
You find jokes where you can get them. Somebody will say something like, I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be an air wing guaranteed. My recruiter told me I'd be an air wing. I don't know, what am I doing out here? I mean, those are the kind of dark jokes that you people start telling. Uh, you realize that you're on the edge sometimes because you've taken wounded, you've taken casualties, you've been out there, you haven't slept well for many days, and you're trying to stay warm. Uh, it's hard. You say I got to get through this day, one more day, see what tomorrow brings. Maybe they'll bring us out of the field tomorrow, but I got to get through the day. That's how I dealt with it.
And I guess being, of course, sharing the experience with others, you form a bond that's unbreakable.
Oh yes, yeah.
Now, go ahead, Bernie.
No, I was just going to confirm what you were saying. Uh,
Well,
in my case, I wasn't a member of the platoon. I wasn't a member of the squad. Uh, so in my particular case, I I I didn't get to know all the people in the squad. I didn't get to know all the people in the platoon. But I was with them, so they knew I was with them. But they knew that I didn't have any particular job as far as machine guns, mortars, ammunition. I was just there to be a grunt. I was there with them. That was the most important thing, that you had to show them that you stayed up nights. You volunteered to do radio watch. You volunteered to help with wounded. You volunteered to carry extra ammunition when there was enough that we had to carry. So people knew that I was there, and I was competent. I wasn't a new guy, and my stories would be written after all the day's work was done.
well, and
Your question was now. Sorry about that.
uh-uh.
It just comes and it goes when you get this age.
Well, and being out there, Bernie, in this wet climate, would your clothes start to deteriorate? Would they start to fall apart?
Yeah, they'd rot on you. I mean, the material was, particularly up north, you were in red clay all the time, and that just kept and the jungle would, you'd go out and the thorns, unbelievable. Every plant had a needle or had a thorn in it, and pretty soon your outer garments are ripped and torn, and you're hoping for a resupply because you told the platoon leader you needed a new pair of trousers or you needed a new jacket because the other one was rotting away. Uh, so the there was no showers, there was no brushing teeth, there was no you just basically hoped that somebody would send in a new resupply of pants and socks and stuff. There was a time when we would have casualties. Uh, this sounds a bit macabre, but it's not. We had casualties, and if your boots were rotted out or you couldn't get resupplied with boots, and someone who was wounded didn't need their boots, you could take them. You took them off and you put them on because you needed them. They didn't.
Well, and I've actually read that in a novel written by an officer who served with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, called Matterhorn.
Oh
Um,
yes, yes, very excellent, excellent.
Matterhorn describes that in detail of a guy getting out of the bush and people are taking the older clothes that they don't need and swapping them out for newer things with guys going out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was a time when like I said, boots were the biggest issue because they rotted so fast in that environment. And your boots were shot, you couldn't get any resupplied, and so on your medevac or your KIA, you took the boots because you needed them.
Well, and you have to do what you have to survive. And footwear is a necessary part of a soldier's life.
Well, yeah, without it, you were in big trouble. You were a casualty yourself if your shoes gave out, your boots gave out, you were done for.
Well,
I mean, it didn't matter if you were size 9 and they were size 12, you still took them.
I mean, you have to use what you have to.
Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to explain there's a reason why I grinned about a minute or so ago is when you were describing clothes rotting off. I remember Dennis and Del Vecchio telling me at different times how when they would take photographs, they'd have to be careful because the groin would be one of the first places to rot out in the utility trousers. And oftentimes you've got everybody's bits hanging out and then you couldn't use those photographs.
Yeah. Well, most of the guys didn't wear boxer shorts. I mean, I did. I had a pair of green boxer shorts, couple pairs. I wore those just simply because they kept me warm. But a lot of guys didn't have boxer shorts, so when the crotch, we called it crotch rot, when you got crotch rot, your pants, fell apart, and then all those privates were hanging out. and and Dennis is right. And you had to look carefully before you shot.
Now, with this experience as well, did you see a lot of jungle rot at the time of guys getting these pusses and sores on them from just the thorns going across the skin?
Constantly, including myself. I mean, when you got into that brush, like I said, it didn't matter if it was a little prick or a big prick. It was going to turn and fester. It was just the nature. So every time you came back from an operation and you got all these little zits and you got all these little infections, Corman just gets you aside, soaks you up, washes you down, puts hydrogen peroxide on you, and that's the kind of treatment you got. Otherwise, they just weep. We call them puss weepers. The pus would just weep and weep unless you could get them cleaned up. Well, and clean them up, you had to get back into an area to get them done. So yeah, every time you went out, it didn't matter how big or how small the barb was. It's going to lead. It was just given. I'm going to end up with weeping pus marks because
Well,
everything instantly infected.
and with that, would some of these casualties have to be taken out for jungle rot because it was so severe?
Uh, well, yeah, there was some occasions where people's feet foot trench. We call it trench foot. Particularly down south where we were in the water and in the rice paddies all the time. And if you didn't have if you couldn't get change socks every now and then, you could end up with a case of trench foot. And once you ended up with sores and you know carbuncles, everything. Once your feet were shot, you were medevac. The other one was heat stroke. On when we were south of Da Nang, there was a lot temperatures 120, and you're out there with no water or very limited water. The end result is some guys had heat stroke. You had to get them out fast as you could.
Well, and speaking of just everyday occurrences, that's how you would deal with casualties that were, non-battle injuries. How would you use the bathroom out in the field? You've got to take a piss, you've got to take a shit. What do you do?
You sit down, take a crap, and hopefully you got some sea ration toilet paper. If not, you got an old magazine or something. There was no time to dig a trench. I mean, unless you're in the rear area. If you're out on patrol, you just crap when you have to, and hope that you got some little bits of toilet paper with you. That was really bad because some of us had, diarrhea so bad that it was constantly running down your leg. You know, uh, so you had diarrhea, you had infections. There wasn't anything you could do. You
And
know, you didn't have time to take your e-tool and dig a hole to crap in. You just crapped wherever you could.
I think the one of the best ways I've heard that described is by a Marine who was telling me the same thing you did, but then he used a phrase that has stuck with me, and he said, "There it is. That just how it was in Vietnam. There it is. You said it about everything, good and bad."
Yeah. Uh, I mean, it was, I mean, what were you going to do? Dig a hole and hold up the platoon as you're patrolling or what? Now you pull off the side for a minute, everybody stands in place, you take a crap, pull up your pants, and you go back on.
Now, with all this, being in the field, the struggles that you faced, when did you finally get into Conti?
I got into Quang right after November 10th. In fact, it was the November the 11th, Veterans Day. They story is November 10th. Of course, the Marines are really big on having their birthday party, and no matter where you are in the world, you're going to have a Marine Corps birthday, which is going to entitle you to a piece of turkey, a piece of cake. It's a big celebration, no matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're in combat or not. they're going to try and get you something, remind you of the Marine Corps birthday. Well, we had a Marine Corps. The 2-1 was in the 2-1 was in the barrel, as we said at Contian, and there was one company that was left behind in reserve, but there was battalion headquarters and 2 companies were up at Contian. One was back in Fubai for resupply and rotation of people coming in and going out, and so all of a sudden, the day after the Marine Corps birthday, guys started getting sick up at Contian. And pretty soon the foreman called down and said, we got an epidemic of food poisoning up here. You know, we've got 20 guys that we got to get out of here because they're desperately sick. So we need to pull 20 or so of you guys out of the trace where you guys are patrolling. We got to have 20 or more sent back up to replace the ones that are going out because of food poisoning. And that was when I found out, well, they're going back up to Contian. I might as well go with them.
Now, did you at least get a shower, being that you were finally back in on the Marine Corps birthday?
Did I what?
Did you at least get
Yeah.
a shower since you were finally out of the field?
Shower?
Yes, sir.
No, there wasn't much of a shower. Contian had about 2 little shower stalls, which were built out of pad. What do you call them? The box pads with a 55-gallon drum with water pumped into it. So there wasn't really a lot of showers. I think I finally got mine about a couple 3-4 days after I came out, but that was because there was the corpsman was down there, you know, giving everybody 5 minutes of this, getting as many of them as washed as we could. Then the big thing was you had to shave. For some reason or the other, they thought if you're Contian, you have to shave. So, you know, most of us would finally have a chance to cut our beard after 10 days or however many days we're out there. I think I've sent a picture of me in Contian and showing my beard for the days.
I haven't seen that one yet. That'll be relevant for next time because we definitely won't get finished with Contian today. But
I'm sorry.
it's okay, Bernie. But
What I've been digging up, and I just found it. I'm sorry to do that, but I I have all my slides, but at some point or the other, I've made pictures. I just can't remember, you know, where they all are. But I knew I had one that would be worth sharing with General Christmas, and I just found it again. Did you get the one of the mortar team?
I did, yes, sir.
If you look in the background, upper right, you'll see that we were taking incoming.
I can actually, yeah, I see that. Let me pull that up real quick for our viewers for today.
I got 2 shots of the mortar team. One is them dropping the round in the tube.
So we'll zoom in on this one. So yeah, you've got 60 millimeter, right? You got the action going on here.
I've got the one where they actually dropped the round in the tube. I was lucky to get that. And then this one is, as you can see back there on the right, that's incoming.
And this is at Contian.
Yes.
And was incoming rounds very common at Contian?
Well, that was kind of the torture thing. Some days they drop 2 rounds, 3 rounds. Some days they wouldn't drop any round, and then another day they'll drop 20 rounds. It was harassment kind of thing. We'd call H&I, harassment and interdiction. But
Well,
yeah, you never knew. I mean, you had enough. You had patrols out there to try and keep them away from using the mortars, but they had artillery on the other side of the DMZ that they used against us.
well, how close is Contian from the DMZ?
Half a mile. It
And
was, well, no, 1 mile, 1 mile south and 1 mile north was the DMZ area.
and with being that close, that's NVA territory. It's not Viet Cong. And secondly, too, I mean, you also have the fact that you constantly have to worry about infiltration. You could have a regiment appear out there. I mean, what's it like at Contian, Bernie?
Well, One is you live in total Connex boxes in a hole in the ground with nothing but uh, mortar round boxes filled with sand to keep the area. If when it rains, it's muddy. It's all red mud, so you get nothing but clay on your clothes and your pants. Uh, you had to keep a platoon plus out patrolling all the time to make sure that. Of course, you had about 80 feet or 90 feet, 100 feet of wire between you and the outside. So there was attempts to probe it, but it was kind of hard living. I think the true word of it is it was trench living. We moved from a battalion bunker to the mess hall. You moved in a trench. If you moved in a trench to get down to the communications, that was how you moved. And you had bunkers all around the way. And when they knew that there was an incoming, they'd sound a horn. And when you heard that horn, you just dug down wherever you were.
And for a lot of the companies, especially one that operated in this area, when they got out of Contian, they get a few weeks respite and then they're thrown into Way City. So there's no respite for a lot of you operating in this area.
No, it didn't work. You went, I was fortunate because, as I've said many times, I could travel from one place to another. And I was up at Contien and was up there, and then on January 30th, I decided that was going to head back down to Fubai at least, check in with the group. And so I caught an airplane out of Dong Ha and landed in the Fubai. And I woke up on the 2nd of February with people going through yelling, "Everybody get out, get out, get out." And they said, due to a minor sniper fire at the Maccabee compound, we're sending up a John Wayne or a reinforced company. Get on the trucks, you'll be back. One of them said, "You'll be back by noon." But that was a short how things went. I've got this picture. I'll send it to you.
Let me minimize
Yeah.
my screen here for a second, Bernie, so we can see this.
This is one that I took. It's an old Scout in a green truck, and it's marked Hotel 25. And that was what we were using to haul ammunition, and that's what we were using to haul wounded back.
I
Because
can
we had,
see the
they,
Hotel 25 on the side of the door.
yeah, they were hot wired by guys that knew how to do it because we needed some vehicles, and of course we couldn't get any. So some guys found a couple of vehicles, and they knew somebody that I suspect knew it by really good experience, hot wired them, and so we had this little yellow Scout which was hauling ammunition for us. And then we had the green truck that was hauling out wounded. So I know that Captain Christmas, General Christmas, probably has never seen this one, but I'll send it to you.
Well, with that, um, and that's phenomenal. I truly cannot wait to get to that point of our conversation about Way City with the research I've done on that. Um, but the fact that you've kept that all these years, I don't think anybody's ever seen that photograph. Because I've read about the Marines in Way City stealing vehicles, hot wiring them, but I didn't know that they were marking them for the companies and battalions in Way
Yeah,
City.
well, that was to make sure nobody stole our stolen vehicle. You know, we stole it and we put our name to it, so therefore it's ours.
And I think I know it's terrible because Way City was awful, but it's the funnier things that truly stick with you. Like that is it's utterly hilarious that people don't know.
Yeah. I mean, humor is what gets you through. It not crying and whining is humor.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Bernie, I'm going to ask you one final question for today, and then I'm going to touch base with you again Tuesday or Wednesday of this coming week. But did Contian have a nickname when you were there?
The barrel.
And
You
well,
were in the barrel, which meant you were just, you were caught in a barrel and they just, they could shoot you in the barrel. That's what I remember. We all referred to it as, being sent up to the barrel.
Well, and because of the consistent artillery, what kind of artillery would the NVA hit you with? Was it 82 millimeter mortars or was it bigger?
They had on their side, they had mountain, or it wasn't a mountain, but it was a mount, and they had a 156 propelled self propelled cannon or artillery. They always had one size bigger than ours or one size smaller than ours, so they could use it. But anyway, they had a 156 up there, and it was mounted on railroad tracks, so they could roll it out, drop some rounds, and then roll it back into the deflet side of the mountain or hill that they had. So we couldn't get them, and it was tunneled inside the mount or the hill. So they'd run it out, take a couple, 3, 4 shots, roll it back in. You couldn't get it, no matter how much they tried. They were still dropping rounds regularly. Most of the small stuff came from 82 mortars that they would hide in the tree line, or they'd actually get down into the DMZ and fire from there. We had something called 4 deuces, 4.2 battery, and they were so worn out. They were really useless because they were so worn out. They were Korean vintage, and the tubes were so old that sometimes you had to be careful of what you call what was the term we used? Short round. And, so when somebody says the 4 deuces are firing, you dug in no matter where you were because there could be a short round. They had several short rounds. So they weren't a really particularly tool that we like to use very often.
Well, and I know what a short round is, but for our viewers, can you explain what a short round is, Bernie?
Yeah, it's made the ones fires out of the tube and then drops because it doesn't, it, for some reason or the other, the ignition doesn't, when it gets ignited, it blows it out, the, or it blows it out the barrel, and then it goes short because it's cut off. The ammunition doesn't burn. So it's a short round. I mean, in other words, it's it's going to go 100 feet. It's going to go 150 feet. It's going to go 50 feet. It's a short round. You don't know where it's going to go, so be dug in when they fire at 4 deuces.
And everybody hit the deck.
Yeah, everybody hit the deck.
Now, in the bunkers at Thien, this will be the last question to end on. What is it like when the artillery rounds come in? What does it feel like for the concussive blast? How do you describe that?
Well, if they're close, they almost grind your teeth. I mean, when they're close, you can tell they bounce up. Your whole body is somewhat lifted up a little bit and then come back down if they're close. If they're not close, it's just like banging your head against the wall. Because if the rounds are coming in, you're inside the bunker, the sandbags, and unless they hit your bunker, you're just kind of like a pea in a can, a couple of peas in a can. They just roll you back and forth a little bit.
Well, I can't imagine the headache that creates as well.
It can cause a really bad headache. Uh, if that's why you're supposed to sit in there with your helmet on. Well, a lot of guys don't sit in there with their helmet on, and so that it just rattles your brain a little bit.
Well, I don't have much of a brain to rattle, so maybe I'd be okay.
I've burned all mine up.
Well,
It's just operating on what's left.
mine's getting there too. Don't worry, Bernie. Phenomenal work today, Bernie. I'm going to pause this there for today. Excellent per usual.